more like running.
Yeah, good call.
Leon, you gotta back up!
Well, the Resident Evil 2 remake is finally here, a game by Capcom that's been in development since 2015, and something that fans have been pining over ever since it was first announced. Well, most people anyway. And for the last few days, it's all I've been playing, in between drinking lots of fluids and eating soft cheese.
Watch out!
Okay, so quick recap in case you've never played the original game before. Resident Evil 2 takes place after the events of Resident Evil 1, as an epidemic caused by the Umbrella Corporation's T-Virus has turned everyone in Raccoon City into mindless, shambling zombies. The epicenter of this story is the Raccoon City Police Department, which harbours some pretty dark secrets, and players would find themselves trapped within, trying to find the means to escape, along with avoiding the abundance of zombies and other creatures that stalk the hallways. Now, this version is a fairly faithful recreation of the events in the original game. You're again choosing to play as Leon Kennedy or Claire Redfield, the sister of Chris from Resident Evil 1, who happens to be in the city around the time of the outbreak searching for his whereabouts.
You really Chris's sister?
Yeah.
Leon and Claire meet up in the prologue, they head into the city and then get separated when some dingbat crashes his truck. And from that point on, we enter the survival horror.
Holy shit.
If this is the first time you're playing this game, then everything's going to be new and fresh, but people who've played Resident Evil 2 are going to notice how Leon and Claire will be visiting most of the same locations, with the main differences again being in the characters they encounter and the weapons they use. Leon, for instance, gets a shotgun, the Magnum pistol, and a flamethrower, whereas Claire gets a grenade launcher, the MAC-10, and the Spark Shot, which is actually really useful against one of the new enemy types you encounter in the sewers, but about as effective as harsh language the rest of the time. There's no bow gun this time though, not that it really matters considering that gun was about as useful as a hot fart. Both characters can also combine herbs to heal, they can craft ammunition and upgrade their inventory space multiple times, which kind of replicates the side pack in the original game that only one character could originally take. Controlling Leon and Claire is just super smooth, the mouse and keyboard just feels really natural and moving things through your inventory and combining items is super intuitive. I mean, you won't be doing dodge rolls or suplexing anyone, but it's way more improved than the original. Story-wise, both characters differ a fair bit too, so for Leon, he manages to escape the police station with the assistance of Ada Wong, whereas Claire does a bit of babysitting duty trying to escape with Sherry Birkin, the daughter of a couple of Umbrella Corporation scientists who are up to no good, and started causing trouble in their neighborhood. Cinematics otherwise are just often exactly the same when these two interact, just with each character swapped around depending on who you're playing as. And if you've played the original game then, well, like I said, a lot of these environments are just going to seem really familiar, and by and large the layout is almost exactly the same. Instead of going to the gun store though in the prologue, instead you'll just start off outside the police station. And a lot like the remake of the first game from a couple of years back, it also adds rooms and new items here and there to make things feel fresh for fans of the original, also in an attempt to help streamline things and prevent too much backtracking. But considering that Resident Evil 2 didn't really have quite the backtracking issues the first game had, I mean these changes are a lot less noticeable. From the sewers onwards is where it just completely reinvents those environments, and in terms of enemies and layouts, they're almost entirely new. Old enemy types like spiders, for instance, have just been completely removed. At this point on, it's really more of a reimagining than a remake, and it follows the motifs of the original, but it just kind of redoes things from scratch. And I do have to say that I found some of these new areas to be the weakest aspect because the new enemies you encounter are just incredibly cheap and annoying, which is in pretty stark contrast to the spiders in the original, which offered up basically no threat. Regardless of who you play as though, you can expect to run into zombies, zombie dogs, lickers, which are still one of the most annoying enemies in the series, and of course the Tyrant, who shows up about a third into the game and then just becomes a prick for the remainder of it. Though I do love how he's wearing a fedora though, like it's somehow going to make him blend in more. Reminds me of when Bane did the same thing in the Batman and Robin movie. The Tyrant can now actually follow you into pretty much every single room, barring save rooms, which just would have been unfair. And it becomes a matter of having to often bait him to one side of the station and then hopefully being able to double back and keep doing what you're originally doing. It's also kind of cool now that he's more of a constant threat. It's like having Jason Voorhees coming after you or something. And hearing this guy just stomping towards you is really unnerving. You can of course shoot him in the head a few times with your best guns, but he doesn't stay down for long and you're better off just running away.
Give me a break.
In between the main Claire and Leon sequences, there's the return of those short stints where you play as either Sherry or Ada, and both of these are pretty much entirely new, Sherry's especially. Thing is though, I thought both of these just kind of sucked and I just wanted to get back to playing as Claire or Leon. The other thing that's been updated, is obviously the visuals, and it should be said that this is just a fantastic looking game at times, with some really superb lighting effects and just stunning environmental detail. Cinematics are really well put together with some decent voice acting and the kind of facial animation that just takes a serious dive into Uncanny Valley. And I think it's also really cool seeing how they've updated all of these characters, like Ada for instance, who now dresses a lot differently, covering herself in an overcoat and hiding her eyes behind some trendy shades to really kind of reinforce her role as this mysterious ally who works alongside Leon. Even the small things too, like how the characters will limp depending on their health condition and they'll even grimace if they're in pain. Like, it's just a really cool attention to detail. What's also neat is that there's no longer loading times when you enter new rooms, and once the game initially loads in, you'll pretty much never be staring at a loading screen ever again. You can go from one side of the police station to the other without interruptions. Now, I know a lot of folks really liked the loading screens in the original games, and they played a big part in the tension of entering a room, because you just never knew what you were going to encounter. But I think the addition of this seamless game, well, now just makes the experience a lot more immersive. Gotta say though that I didn't really notice the new soundtrack all that much, like considering how iconic and memorable the old stuff was, I found it just a little bit odd that the new stuff just didn't stick out for me. I couldn't even tell you what my favourite new track was, which is a bit of a shame. At least they've improved the gore system though, like this is just an awesomely violent game. It really feels like you're watching some kind of late 80s or early 90s horror movie, and it just helps the game's tone immensely. Like, this is a really dark and violent horror game at times, but it's also aware of its roots and it doesn't always take itself too seriously. I guess I should talk about the performance too. Now look, all things considered, this seemed to run pretty well on my PC. And it's got that cool thing in the options menu where it shows an example of what each setting looks like when it's on or off. And of course, like always, I always turn off motion blur and chromatic aberration because I'm not a trash can. One thing I don't like though is the way this engine does anti-aliasing, which I think just makes everything look super blurry. When you've got it off, the game does look sharper, but then you see these weird graphical glitches and the hair on character models now looks like it's made out of ants. I had issues with the texture streaming too, which you'll probably notice in some of the footage, which might just be from me not being able to use day one drivers. But I think overall the game runs and looks great, and that's something we just don't see all that often for these cross-platform titles. Now, what is kind of odd though is that even though the game's been updated visually and it has all this new stuff added in, the combat side of things is still really antiquated, which admittedly has probably been done this way on purpose. The shooting is okay, but it really just feels like the original with the option to manual aim. Unlike the original, obviously there's no fixed camera angles anymore and it controls more like your typical third-person shooter, allowing the player to manually aim, which gives a much higher level of control and precision to the shooting. But I mean, if you've played Resident Evil 4, 5 and 6, well, this is nothing new. The thing is though, I found the enemies in this game to be super spongy, even more so than the other games. Which I mean is old school and it makes sense considering the way the shooting used to work in the original, but it is kind of juxtaposed with the realistic and modern presentation and it just feels kind of archaic. Like for instance, the amount of times you have to shoot a zombie before they go down is often just fucking ludicrous. The way the shooting works is that once you're aiming with a weapon, if you wait like a second or so, the crosshair's gonna shrink down to size, which apparently increases damage done and chances of a critical hit. Now, upgrading guns makes this reticle shrink faster, but early on and against multiple enemies, this mechanic can just be a real pain in the ass. And then sometimes even still, you can shoot a zombie 4, 5 or 6 times in the head and it does not kill them. And then even if they do seemingly go down, they'll often just get right back up a little bit later and keep chasing after you as if nothing's happened. What you're after is that elusive critical hit which causes their head to explode. I mean, that's the good stuff. There's even a cinematic where Leon meets Ada for the first time, and even in this, they have to shoot a dog in the head 3 times before it dies. Now look, I might excuse this for the weaker guns like the starting pistols, but the more powerful weapons should be instant kills every single time. The shotgun, for instance, was a gun that was usually always an instant kill in the original at point blank range, able to remove a basic zombie's head from their shoulders time after time, and it felt damn good to use. Here it sometimes doesn't even do that.
Son of a bitch.
It's just kind of weird to me, and I understand it's been done to balance out the gameplay a bit, because if you could just shoot everything in the head once and be done with it, well, all tension would go out the window. but I'd rather be rewarded for my accuracy. Instead, I'm given a slap across the face. The other option, if you don't want to shoot them in the head, is to shoot their legs off, which causes them to become much less mobile, where they'll kind of crawl across the ground and comically reach out at you. Further add insult to injury, you can also shoot off both of their arms, turning them into a zombified version of the Black Knight from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And I have to admit that watching a stumpy zombie shuffle around trying to bite me is kind of hilarious. But even then, these dickheads can still grab onto you even when they're missing 2 legs and an arm, so you're never truly safe. But I mean, getting bit on the ankles is far better than the back of the neck. And this is all just for the basic zombies too, like this doesn't apply to the dogs, the lickers, and the other new enemy types, some of whom kill you in a single hit, on standard difficulty, even when you've got full health. Yeah, sounds fun, doesn't it? You're either going to have to try to run past them, which is easier said than done because of how huge the player's hitboxes are, or you just have to use up some of your much coveted ammo and kill them. If you're going to be returning to a room that might have like a licker in it, for instance, well, it's probably a safer bet to kill them. Boss fights where it all just kind of falls apart for me though, because there's basically been nothing done to improve the way it worked in the original. So like before, all this is really about is using your most powerful weapons and hopefully beating the boss by shooting the giant weak spots before you run out of ammo and healing items. In between dodging their freight container sized hitboxes and marveling at how Claire and Leon move without any haste whatsoever. Now look, I know I just described like every boss fight ever made, but I think people who play Resident Evil know you almost need to plan ahead for boss fights in these games, and really hang on to stockpiles of ammo for your better guns. Like heaven help you if you get stuck in one with nothing but a measly pistol. And I do think this is maybe the weakest aspect of the remake. But you know what, I hated the boss fights in the original game, and I went in expecting to hate these boss fights too. And I did, so mission accomplished. This is what kind of makes the whole thing so odd sometimes, because it's like this weird mix of the old school design that's going to appeal to fans of the original, but then it also has those newer elements that's going to trap in newer gamers. Like on standard difficulty, you've got unlimited saves as well as checkpoints when you finish key objectives, and it really does look and control like a standard third-person shooter. But it's like a thin coating over what's really a pretty challenging game underneath. And I think those old school design elements are really going to alienate a lot of new players. Like this thing is just unabashedly survival horror, and it really doesn't give two shits about the player, which is a good thing. And even then, if standard difficulty is too easy, you can ramp it up to hardcore difficulty, which reintroduces limited saves through ink ribbons and also makes enemies even stronger too. When you're playing on hardcore, pretty much every single hit you take from an enemy puts you right into a danger state as well. It also changes the placement of certain items to later on in the campaign, so you'll get the Magnum or the MAC-10 much later than you do in the standard mode. Oh, and it also limits the amount of inventory space you have, keeping it more in line with the original game, reintroducing that whole backtracking and inventory management aspect. So for people who are going to complain that standard difficulty mode's too easy or too casual, well, this mode is for you. All up, finishing Leon's campaign took me about 6 hours, and then Claire's took me around 5. I think the fact that I've finished the original game so many times probably helped me finish it a little bit faster. But even seeing all there is to do, a first playthrough I can't see taking longer than 8 or 9 hours for each character. But look, anyone who's played these games knows that finishing the story is just the tip of the iceberg.
Hell of a night, huh?
When you finish the campaign for both Leon and Claire, you can also play what's essentially the B scenarios for both characters too, which is called the second run. And this changes the starting location, the layouts of enemies and items, and it also adds in new sequences and encounters. It also adds in some new guns to use, and on top of that, you can then complete these campaigns in the hardcore mode. After you finish both of these, which is like another 5 or 6 hours, then there's also a whole heap of weapons and costumes to unlock and the return of the 4th survivor mode. So there's a veritable shitload of stuff to get through. I mean, if you just play the campaign once and complain it's not worth your money, well, I gotta say, you're playing the game wrong.
You need help.
Overall, Resident Evil 2 definitely frustrated me here and there, but I also had a really good experience for the vast majority of the time. And overlooking some of the balancing issues, which are really part and parcel to what makes a Resident Evil game, I think this is definitely something that's been worth the wait. It's not quite as faithful to the original as the first remake was, and it does take more than a few liberties with the design and layout of environments, which I can understand is going to piss off a lot of people, but if you are hoping for a return to form for survival horror, a challenging, resource-restricting experience where death awaits you around every corner, well, you're not going to be disappointed.